Welcome to Exim Bank's webinar. This is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars conducted here at the bank. This webinar will be recorded and can be found at www.exim.gov. My name is Augustine Grace. I am a Senior Business Development Officer, Senior Manager, and Director of Veterans Relations here at the bank. We will be making a 25-minute presentation basically covering the loan and guarantee program here at Exim Bank. We want to allow for questions at the end. If you want to send us a question, simply go to the lower right-hand corner of your screen to the question box to type and submit your questions. We will respond to them at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce you to today's speaker, Mr. Kyle Jackson. Kyle is a Trade Finance Officer in the Trade Finance Division here at headquarters. He has been with the bank for well over 10 years and has held various positions here throughout the bank. He is our senior instructor at our 2-day training that we conduct here every other month. I will now turn the presentation over to Kyle.
Good afternoon. As Gus has noted, my name is Kyle Jackson, and I am a loan officer, trade finance officer here at Exim Bank. And today we will be covering Exim Bank's medium and long-term financing programs. A quick review of the agenda will show that the presentation is divided up into approximately 4 sections. First, we will cover the general policies that either impact or govern the financing Exim Bank participates in. Then we will talk about the medium-term financing, then our long-term financing program, and then ultimately how to apply. Exim Bank is a member of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. This organization governs the way export credit agencies can support their indigenous exporters when providing financing for their international buyers. The concept behind the OECD arrangement is to create what is called a level playing field. That being that no exporter is advantaged by the financing they are offering their buyer, and that transactions and export orders will be won or lost on the qualitative nature of the product or service that is being offered. The OECD arrangement governs various aspects of the financings. These include the amount of the cash payment, the interest rate, the maximum repayment term on the loan, level principal payments throughout the life of the loan, the starting point of the loan, as well as the fee each export agency can charge for taking the risk on the transaction. Additional policies here at Exim Bank include our content policy, which governs the amount of what we identify as eligible foreign content, which is allowable in products that are manufactured or sourced from the United States, local cost, military, used equipment, and obviously fees charged by the bank. U.S. content. As an agency of the United States government, Exim Bank will only finance a majority of those goods and services that are produced or sourced from the United States. However, we do recognize that in today's global environment, it is very difficult to have a product that is solely produced in the United States, and that would include looking at raw materials used to manufacture that product. Therefore, we do allow for a certain degree of what we call eligible foreign content to be included in that product. Eligible foreign content is defined as any item that is sourced from overseas that is brought into the United States or into U.S. territories, either assembled into a U.S. item and or a standalone item that is then exported out. We will allow for approximately 1/5, that is 15% of eligible foreign content to be included in Exim Bank's financing. Anything greater than 15% would impact the Exim Bank financing structure. Local cost financing. Local cost is the cost the exporter would incur in the country where its borrower is located. For instance, if you are manufacturing or installing a piece of machinery in a foreign country and you need to actually hire local labor and or brick and mortar to build that piece, build a factory and or to install that machine, well, you are not going to actually bring over U.S. labor to do that. You're going to do that in the country of your borrower. We will allow for up to 30% of what we consider to be the net U.S. contract value to be financed in local cost. And that is the ability to actually finance labor and or services that are sourced outside the United States but are supporting the U.S. project or the U.S. product. Eligible requirements for medium and long-term financing are different, but ultimately Ex-Im Bank requires for the local costs to be a part of the exporter's responsibilities, and it should be codified in the export contract. Military. Ex-Im Bank is prohibited from supporting military goods and or sales to military entities overseas. There are, however, 3 exceptions to this rule. We will support humanitarian exports, such as items that are going to a military clinic overseas, and that clinic perhaps services its civilian population. Goods that are being used to support drug interdiction, such as the sale of helicopters and or vehicles that will be used to patrol the border to prohibit the smuggling of drugs, and what we identify as dual-use items. And that would be items that are purchased by a military entity but have a predominant civilian application. An example here would be air traffic control radars, purchased by a foreign borrower, perhaps a foreign military organization. However, the air traffic control radars themselves would be utilized to manage the overflight of civilian aircraft. So although those items are quote-unquote operated and were purchased by a military entity, they are utilized primarily for a civilian application, and thus they have a dual use. Used and refurbished equipment. Ex-Im Bank recognizes that there is a very large market for used and refurbished equipment that has been originally manufactured here in the United States. Therefore, we do support used and refurbished equipment. However, to have your equipment supported by Ex-Im Bank, we do ask that that equipment meets certain eligible criteria. First and foremost, we say that it must be originally manufactured in the United States. Second, we say prior to approaching Ex-Im Bank for export, that equipment must have been domiciled in the United States for a period of minimally 1 year. And that is, you cannot purchase U.S. manufactured equipment abroad, bring it into the United States with the intent of approaching Ex-Im Bank for financing. If you do that, then the equipment again must be domiciled in the United States minimally for 1 year. If it is not domiciled in the United States, and or if that equipment was not originally manufactured in the United States, then it will impact the amount of financing available from Ex-Im Bank. If neither one of those criteria are met, Ex-Im Bank would view the production cost of that equipment as eligible foreign content, meaning that at a production level, that equipment cannot exceed 15% of the amount of financing you are requesting from Ex-Im Bank. If it does, then Ex-Im Bank would have to reduce the amount of financing available to your buyer. We are now going to discuss Ex-Im Bank's medium-term financing program. Ex-Im Bank has 3 products to support medium-term financing. Medium-term financing is financing that has a repayment term of anywhere from 5 to 7 years and does not exceed $10 million. The 3 products we have to support medium-term financing are export credit insurance, loan guarantees, and direct loans. It is important to note that Ex-Im Bank does very few medium-term direct loans. Key features, again, of our medium-term policy, and I discussed some of these earlier, are that the maximum financed amount would be $10 million. The maximum repayment term is typically 5 years. In exceptional circumstances, we will consider 7 years. We require minimally a 15% cash down payment, and we will cover 100% of the remaining balance of principal and interest, which would include 85% of the export value. Medium-term insurance, or what was referred to as export credit insurance on the previous slide, is an extension of credit made to a foreign buyer to procure U.S. capital equipment and or services. It generally involves a bank, although medium-term insurance can be extended to a U.S. exporter who is in turn extending credit to its foreign buyer. Again, it's for $10 million or less and has a repayment term of 5 years. Okay. Ex-Im Bank would issue an insurance policy to the insured. Again, it can be a bank or an exporter. And that insurance policy would cover the repayment of the extension of credit to the foreign borrower. We have multiple insurance policies here at Ex-Im Bank. Some insurance policies will cover a single shipment to a foreign buyer. Some insurance policies will support multiple shipments to a foreign buyer. And some insurance policies will support multiple shipments to a foreign buyer from multiple U.S. exporters here in the United States. Under medium term, we require what's called disbursement documents. These are the documents that, as an exporter, you may present to a financial institution here in the United States that may be benefiting from Ex-Im Bank's coverage, which in turn is providing the loan to your borrower or to your buyer of goods. The disbursement documentations generally are a promissory note, which is generally issued by Ex-Im Bank to the financial institution or to the U.S. exporter that's extending the credit to the foreign borrower. We will require a copy of the invoice and the export bill of lading and a document which is called the export certificate. Now, you will note that many of these documents are generally used in everyday commercial practices. This is by design, as Ex-Im Bank likes to use its medium-term financing to supplement and complement traditional and standard commercial practices currently in use. The export certificate is a document that is unique to Ex-Im Bank. It is completed by the U.S. exporter, and among other things, it verifies the amount of U.S. content that is in the goods being supported, as well as it verifies whether or not the U.S. exporter has made arrangements to receive the cash payment from the foreign borrower. All Ex-Im Bank transactions must have a completed export certificate. Without a completed export certificate, Ex-Im Bank is unable to finance the transaction. Medium-term loan guarantees. A loan guarantee is made to a guaranteed lender. A guaranteed lender is generally a commercial bank and or financial institution. It could be here in the United States and or one located overseas that is extending a loan, a line of credit, to a foreign borrower. Ex-Im Bank guarantees the repayment of that extension of credit. Okay. Again, for medium term, we will finance up to $10 million, and generally we have repayment terms of 7 years, 5 being very typical, but again, exception of 7 years or less. The features of the medium-term guarantee are very similar to those features we talked about earlier, which covered our medium-term insurance. We will cover 100% of the principal and interest for 85% of the U.S. contract price. The interest rate is set by the lender. It is not set by Ex-Im Bank under a medium-term guarantee. So therefore, it is typically a commercial rate negotiated between the lender and the borrower. Medium guarantees issued by Ex-Im Bank are fully transferable. That is, banks can sell Ex-Im Bank-backed transactions amongst themselves. We will finance in certain foreign currencies, and during the life of the loan, the borrower does have the option to switch the interest rate from a floating rate to a fixed rate. The primary documentation for a medium guarantee is very similar to that documentation which is required for medium-term insurance. You will note at the bottom of the slide we do include the bill of lading, which we've already discussed, the export certificate. We also have a promissory note which is issued by the lender to the borrower. Additional documentation for medium guarantees include what is called an Annex A, which is a document that is issued between Ex-Im Bank and the guaranteed lender, as well as a master guarantee agreement. Again, another document issued between Ex-Im Bank and the lender. As an exporter, you would not be a party to the master guarantee agreement and or the Annex A. These are not documents you would need to concern yourself with. It is only if you are a financial institution and you intend to lend under Ex-Im Bank's coverage would you need to execute these documents with Ex-Im Bank. We spoke about this very briefly early on in the presentation, and that is local cost. And again, local cost is the cost incurred to an exporter overseas that is related to the goods or the project that they have been contracted to either build or provide for a foreign borrower. For medium-term transactions, Ex-Im Bank requires that the local cost be part of the sales contract. That is, the document you execute with your buyer must clearly codify the responsibilities of the U.S. exporter as it relates to local cost. If it is codified within your contract, and assuming that the buyer cannot find additional financing to support such local cost, Ex-Im Bank will finance local costs, will add local costs as part of its overall financing commitment for the transaction. We are now going to talk very briefly about Ex-Im Bank's long-term financing programs. Ex-Im Bank has two financial products to support long-term lending. That would be loan guarantees and direct loans. For long-term transactions, the maximum repayment term are determined by where the borrower is domiciled. Category 1 countries are those countries which are typically defined as G7 and or highly developed countries such as Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and so on. In those markets, depending upon what your contract amount is, Ex-Im Bank can finance transactions up to 5 years. This means irrespective of the size of the transaction, typically the longest repayment term we would be able to support in a Category 1 country is 5 years. However, for a majority of the countries Ex-Im Bank participates and does financing in, we can consider tenures of much longer term. For instance, if you had a transaction in the country of Nigeria and the contract amount was approximately $25 million, Ex-Im Bank could consider a repayment term of 10 years or more. Direct loan. Unlike guarantees in insurance, which involve either a bank or an exporter extending credit to its borrower with Ex-Im Bank's assistance, for direct loans, Ex-Im Bank is actually lending the money itself. We are not actually utilizing a bank to serve as a source of funds. Ex-Im Bank and or the United States government is the source of funds. Direct loans are structured very similar to our medium-term and long-term guarantees in that Ex-Im Bank will support 85% of the U.S. contract price. They are typically done at a fixed interest rate. We always would use a letter of credit as a disbursement method to reimburse the exporter. And we have what's called a shipping rule. It is best to utilize a direct loan when your buyer insists on fixed rate financing and or you as a U.S. exporter are competing against a foreign competitor that has brought what is called tied aid financing or concessionary financing. Concessionary financing is defined as financing that provides terms and rates that are well below what the market can offer. In such a circumstance, it is impossible for a commercial bank, which has to actually go to the capital markets itself to acquire funding, to actually compete and provide a competitive rate. Therefore, in such instances where tied-aid competition is proven, the United States government will step in and provide a very low interest rate loan to your borrower to support their acquisition of U.S. exporters. For local costs under long term, again, the coverage is the same. It is 30%. And generally because most long-term financing supports projects such as the construction of a hydroelectric dam or a power plant, local cost is automatically included if the exporter requests it. Therefore, we do not require for the local cost to be part of the export contract, although sometimes and very often it is for long-term financing. Who can apply at Ex-Im Bank? Who can be the applicant at Ex-Im Bank is determined by the type of financial product you're actually applying for. For medium-term insurance, a U.S. exporter can apply, or a lender can apply on behalf of either its customer, the exporter, and or its customer could be the foreign borrower. You can also apply for what's called a letter of interest. A letter of interest is a non-binding commitment from Ex-Im Bank that indicates to a foreign buyer Ex-Im Bank's willingness to consider the project, assuming it meets certain criteria. Because this is a non-binding commitment, anyone can apply. So even after we issue a letter of interest, it simply provides an indication of what we're willing to do. A preliminary commitment, anyone can apply. However, Ex-Im Bank limits when individuals can apply for a preliminary commitment. A preliminary commitment is an actual application to the bank for financing, which means that Ex-Im Bank would undertake and perform all the requisite due diligence to determine whether or not it believes this transaction is creditworthy. If it is creditworthy, Ex-Im Bank will issue an approval, and that approval states that if the U.S. exporter wins the export order, then Ex-Im Bank's financing is assured for its foreign borrower. But again, there are limited circumstances that Ex-Im Bank will do a preliminary commitment because it does involve a substantial amount of resources. And therefore, we do ask that typically if you are applying for Ex-Im Bank financing, we do ask that you already have won the export order. If you have won the export order, if you've executed a sales contract or a pro forma invoice or received a purchase order, then you can apply for what's called a final commitment application for either a guarantee and or a direct loan. Because of the fact that guarantees are only available to lenders or to financial institutions, we generally say that only a mandated lender or a guaranteed lender can apply for a final commitment. In some rare instances, foreign borrowers will directly apply to Ex-Im Bank for a final commitment application. But as I mentioned, because of the fact that Ex-Im Bank typically does most of its lending through other institutions, through banks, we do generally request that they approach a lender, work with the lender to package this application, and then submit it to Ex-Im Bank. Ex-Im Bank has a number of initiatives that it has established over the years to support various sectors and various industries throughout the United States and abroad. First and foremost is what is called sub-sovereign risk. Years ago, when Ex-Im Bank did financing and government-to-government lending, typically that lending would be from the United States government to a central bank or to a minister of finance. However, over the years, we have found that oftentimes the central authorities in various countries that we do business in do not necessarily have the budgetary resources and or believe the priorities of certain projects are at the top of their list to actually apply their funding. So what we have done is we've looked at going below what we call sovereign risk and looking at sub-sovereign risk. An example of sub-sovereign risk would be such as the city or municipality of St. Petersburg, Russia, approaching Ex-Im Bank and requesting a loan to support its acquisition of U.S. exports. Before, we would require the city of St. Petersburg to go to the Central Bank of Russia and get the central bank to provide us support. However, because of the fact that St. Petersburg, using this as an example, has gone to the international capital markets, it does have a bond rating, it has borrowed money without the support of the central bank, Ex-Im Bank can look directly at that municipality to consider it for an extension of credit. An additional industry where Ex-Im Bank looks to provide alternative means of support is the medical industry. There are several medical institutions throughout the world that were formerly owned or operated by the government but have been privatized over the last decade or two that need to update their equipment, and they do have a preference to purchase American. However, Because of the fact that they were formerly owned by the government, because of the fact that they initially were probably part of the Ministry of Health, they do not have financial statements. They do not have any type of credit documentation that demonstrates history. Therefore, Ex-Im Bank has approached these transactions with what we call alternative credit standards. Typically, when you apply to Ex-Im Bank and you are a private sector borrower, we would require 3 years' worth of audited financial statements. However, if you are a medical institution and you've recently been privatized, we waive the requirement for 3 years. Perhaps you only have 2 years. Perhaps you only have 1 year. We will look at those financial statements, and we will also look at what we call forecasting and or financial assumptions, looking at future revenue flows based on whether or not the equipment is put online and would it generate additional cash flow. So for Ex-Im Bank in these types of transactions, it's a unique way to combine both traditional trade finance with what we would call project financing to determine whether or not these obligors are creditworthy. In addition, we will do equipment financing through what we call asset-backed transactions. Once again, we would do this by not relying solely on the historic balance sheet of a borrower. We look at future cash flows and things of that nature. We look at perhaps taking liens or other types of security to get comfortable with the obligor. Co-financing. This is when Ex-Im Bank teams up with another export credit agency and provides a single credit package to a foreign borrower. Co-financing has been quite common in Europe, where you have European companies competing for transactions, and when they win those transactions, they're sourcing from all over the continent. So what they'll do is they'll approach their indigenous export credit agency and ask for a single financing package. But what is happening in turn is that export credit agency is going to all the other export credit agencies and effectively being reinsured on the portion of goods that are coming from those countries. What this effectively does is it streamlines the documentation. Prior to having co-financing, if you were a U.S. exporter and you had a project in a country and you were sourcing from 2 different countries, your borrower may have had to fill out 2 different sets of credit documentation. Now that we have co-financing, that is no longer a requirement. The borrower only has to fill out 1 set of credit documentation, which ultimately cuts down on the amount of fees that are spent, obviously, to document the transaction. Lastly, Ex-Im Bank has an environmental exports transaction. Ex-Im Bank recognizes that U.S. exporters are the lead in environmental technology, and we also recognize that many of these transactions occur in countries where it sometimes is very difficult to obtain financing. Therefore, we have created various initiatives and various incentives to bring foreign borrowers or to incentivize foreign borrowers to use Ex-Im Bank and purchase from U.S. exporters. That concludes the brief summary of Ex-Im Bank's medium and long-term financing program. I appreciate your appreciation, and we will now take questions. Thank you. I've received some questions. The first question is, can ferrous or non-ferrous scrap metal be financed as well? The answer to that question is yes, depending upon the nature, the type of metals that are actually being financed. We can finance scrap metal. However, it's important to note that since scrap metal is typically an input stock and oftentimes identified as a raw material, we do not finance scrap metal at medium or long term. We will finance scrap metal for what we call short term, and that is repayment terms of 360 days or less. Does Ex-Im Bank do financing leasing is the next question. The answer to that question is yes. Ex-Im Bank does do financing leasing. Typically, the leasing structures are similar to our standard medium-term financing structures, since financing leasing oftentimes is simply another means to procure goods and services. Question: How does one confirm that one's technology is proven? There are several ways to do that. It is true that Ex-Im Bank typically does not finance quote-unquote new or unproven technology. So the question is, what type of technology are we talking about, and whether or not that technology is regulated or requires any types of certifications from the United States government or any other type of regulatory authority. If it does, oftentimes those certifications can go and provide some degree of validity or verification that the technology is proven. We do prefer for the technology to have previously been deployed, so there is a track record of its performance. If it has not previously been deployed, and if there are no certifications, then we clearly would have to do additional due diligence to determine whether or not that technology is viable enough to receive support from Ex-Im Bank. Next question. How long does it take for medium-term insurance, cost, fees to exporter? Ex-Im Bank currently processes or on average processes medium-term insurance applications in a period of approximately 30 business days. That can go up and down depending upon the nature of the transaction and obviously its complexity. It's important to note that Ex-Im Bank's ability to respond quickly or promptly to a medium-term request is directly linked to how complete the application is. If there is a necessity to require or request additional information, that could prolong the processing time. The cost of the insurance is determined by the level of risk associated with the transaction. For instance, if your buyer is located in what we would determine a high-risk market and or your buyer has financial ratios that deem it to be high risk, the cost could be somewhat significant or somewhat higher than typically you would find in the capital markets. An example would be a medium-term insurance to certain markets for 5 years might cost you, on average, having a premium fee of approximately anywhere from 5.6 upwards to 7.6%. Okay? Are there any fees to the exporter if you apply for medium-term insurance? The answer to that question is no. The application fee to apply for medium-term insurance is free, so therefore there is no inherent cost directly to the exporter. However, in any circumstance, it is not uncommon, although it is not necessarily frequent, where the buyer may ask the exporter to assume some of the premium cost and or to lower the cost of its overall product to make up for the cost of having to secure insurance. This doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, and if you are a U.S. exporter looking to utilize Ex-Im Bank's medium-term insurance, I encourage you, once you've identified your borrower, to approach Ex-Im Bank to get a more accurate assessment of what the costing can be so you can provide your foreign buyer a more accurate assessment or a notional assessment of what it may cost to use Ex-Im Bank's insurance. Next question, what countries are we lending to? Ex-Im Bank does lending in over 130 countries throughout the world. We lend to a majority of the markets where Ex-Im Bank would consider itself open. What I would encourage you to do is go to our website, which is www.exim.gov, and look up a document called the Country Limitation Schedule, oftentimes abbreviated CLS. The CLS will identify all the markets where Ex-Im Bank is open to do business, as well as identifying the term Ex-Im Bank is willing to support. In some markets, because of macroeconomic situations or macro-political situations, we may not be able to do financing in excess of 1 year or in excess of 7 years. So therefore, there may be some limitations on those markets because of what we would consider to be high-risk factors that cannot be appropriately mitigated. So please visit our website and review the CLS to determine those markets where we're open to do business. If we are open to do business, then Ex-Im Bank will consider a transaction in that market. Question, does Ex-Im Bank play a role in franchise setup? Yes, we do. Ex-Im Bank has financed several franchises overseas. We have financed both franchising licenses as well as the procurement of the various hardware that many franchises require their franchisees to purchase to obviously sell their product. So yes, we do. Question. Difference between medium-term insurance or medium-term guarantees. This is a very good question, and the slideshow did not delineate this information enough. Medium-term insurance is what is called a conditional product. The conditionality means that even after you file a claim, if you did not adhere to the medium-term insurance documentation in the policy and guidelines, Ex-Im Bank can deny your claim. Medium-term guarantees is an unconditional commitment. We say no matter what, Ex-Im Bank will pay the obligation should a claim be filed if you secured a medium-term guarantee. There is a pricing differential between medium-term insurance and medium-term guarantees. The pricing differential varies by transaction and by market. However, it can be anywhere from 15 basis points upwards to 100 basis points, again, depending upon the nature of the transaction. Question. Does Ex-Im Bank require documents in English? Typically, yes. Ex-Im Bank does require for the documents or the application to be filed in English. However, depending upon the amount of the credit, and in some circumstances, Ex-Im Bank will accept documentation in Spanish. Generally, this is for transactions that are $1 million or less. If it's in excess of $1 million, it must be in English and/or it must have certified translations. If it is less than $1 million, we can accept it in Spanish. If it is less than $500,000, and depending upon the nature, we've also accepted documents in Portuguese. Question. Does Ex-Im Bank have experience with EU reconstruction funds beneficiaries to ensure payment on such projects? Ex-Im Bank has participated in a number of projects that does include other export credit agencies or, in many circumstances, other multilateral or multi-development banks, such as the IMF, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and such forth. So yes, we do have experience in dealing with various things. I can't speak specifically of whether or not we've done with EU reconstruction funds. However, I can say that to the extent that if they are involved in the regions where Ex-Im Bank is involved, there's a high probability that we have dealt with them at some time. I encourage you, should you want additional information on this, to contact Ex-Im Bank or perhaps the regional office which supports your region area and provide them specifics of the transaction you're inquiring about, and we can look and determine whether or not you've actually worked with the EU Reconstruction Fund. Is there a long-term program for the purchase of inventory longer than 12 months? Typically, inventory can only be supported for a period of generally 12 months or less. This is because the inventory oftentimes is going to be utilized as input stock for the construction of items. However, if your inventory is capital goods, such as if you were a dealer of tractors or cars or other items that may not necessarily be procured within a 12-month cycle depending upon the economy, yes, we can support inventory for a period in excess of 12 months. It is not uncommon for Ex-Im Bank to support foreign dealers of U.S. manufacturers of both tractors and cars with a medium-term insurance or guarantee product for 2 to 3 years, meaning that once they buy your stock, your rolling stock, they have 2 to 3 years to repay back the Ex-Im Bank loan. Typically, once the foreign borrower sells the asset, we do ask for them to repay that portion of the loan related to that particular asset. Question. Are Ex-Im Bank's products limited to the banks and financial institutions? The answer is no. As I mentioned earlier, for medium-term insurance, U.S. companies or exporters can come in and apply for a medium-term insurance policy. However, outside of that, if you're applying for a guarantee or if you're applying for a direct loan, generally the applicant must either be a bank, financial institution, and or the borrower of the funds. If you do not fit in either of those categories, I encourage you to contact Ex-Im Bank directly and speak to an Ex-Im Bank regional officer to determine whether or not your company can benefit as a beneficiary for Ex-Im Bank's financing as an applicant. Question: any experience lending to Sierra Leone? Yes, Ex-Im Bank does have some limited experience lending to Sierra Leone. We have not lent to the market in some time due to macroeconomic conditions, but we have a vast wealth of experience lending to sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, Ex-Im Bank has a sub-Saharan Africa initiative which specifically tasks a significant amount of Ex-Im Bank resources to both develop and underwrite business within the sub-Saharan African region. Question: are you required to be a manufacturer? No, you are not required to be a manufacturer to benefit from Ex-Im Bank's financing. Ex-Im Bank supports a number of distributors or dealers in the United States that do not manufacture anything. We also support a number of trading companies that, again, do not manufacture anything. They acquire their goods either directly from the manufacturer or they may buy it on the open market. Regardless, if they are exporting those goods overseas, Ex-Im Bank can support their foreign buyers' acquisition of their goods. Question: is Ex-Im Bank still doing business with Egypt? Answer is yes. Ex-Im Bank is still open within Egypt. Therefore, at this time, if you have a transaction in Egypt, we can consider it. However, given the fact that the situation in Egypt is somewhat fluid, it is possible that Ex-Im Bank could see a material change to the market which could impact our cover policy and may limit our ability to support ongoing transactions in that market. However, currently we are open in Egypt, and I'm not aware of any information at present that would close us in the market. Question: what is Ex-Im Bank's track record with Colombia? Ex-Im Bank overall has a default ratio of approximately 3%. That is much lower than you would find in the commercial sector. That is because we have a significant amount of experience with underwriting transactions internationally. As far as our track record with a specific market, I cannot speak to that right now because I do not have the information in front of me. However, I can say that in general, given our overall track record, I would say our track record probably is fairly good. Colombia is a market where we have a substantial amount of business in. Like all markets, it is cyclical. There are some times when we've had a substantial, or should I say, we've had a very good track record in the market, and there are some times where the market has gone through an economic decline, which has led to, unfortunately, a uptick in claims activity. For instance, in the 1980s, Ex-Im Bank had significant experience in Mexico. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, there also was a Mexican debt crisis, which led ultimately to a number of Mexican companies that had taken out loans backed by Ex-Im Bank being unable to honor their obligations. This was simply a fact of the macroeconomic environment, and it was not an issue of the companies unwilling unwilling to make those commitments or meet those commitments. In that instance, Ex-Im Bank restructured many of those loans, and ultimately the loans were paid off in full. I would say the same has happened in Colombia, and it did happen in the 1990s, and we did see an uptick in claim activity. However, overall, our experience in the market has been satisfactory. To the extent that if Ex-Im Bank finds itself in a market where we do not believe there is a strong possibility of repayment, that would be reflected on a country limitation schedule. A country limitation schedule would clearly articulate the fact that Ex-Im Bank's cover policy is restricted in that market. And those restrictions could be due to the fact that historically the losses have been so great that we simply do not see that as a viable market. That is not the case with Columbia, as we are open. Do you currently have transactions in the Philippines? I am not aware currently of any transactions that Ex-Im Bank is processing in the Philippines. However, it is important to note that I do not necessarily cover all of Ex-Im Bank's transactions. Therefore, it is very possible that we do have transactions in the Philippines. The Philippines historically is a market where Ex-Im Bank has done a substantial amount of business. Therefore, it is very probable, highly probable, that we do have a transaction somewhere in Ex-Im Bank that is being processed for a Filipino borrower. We are open in the Philippines, so therefore if you have a transaction in the Philippines you'd like Ex-Im Bank to consider, I would encourage you to approach the bank. Question: can U.S. shipping costs be included in financing? Yes. Ex-Im Bank will support the U.S. shipping costs related to the export of a U.S. manufactured item. This is quite common, in fact, that Ex-Im Bank covers all U.S. sourcing into a particular project. Generally, for the financing itself, we can support any and everything that is being sourced from the United States. Okay? Again, if it is being sourced outside the United States, and if it is not brought into the United States, then we would consider that foreign content, and it may be considered ineligible foreign content, which means that either the borrower would have to support them out of their own pocket, or Ex-Im Bank would participate in a co-financing structure to finance that for your borrower as well. But yes, U.S. shipping costs can be included in Ex-Im Bank's financing. Question: does Ex-Im Bank deal with Venezuelan buyers? Currently, Ex-Im Bank is closed in Venezuela, so we would not be able to consider any transactions where the buyer is domiciled in Venezuela. Question: can medium-term agreements be converted to long-term, and if so, under what conditions? Generally, if Ex-Im Bank is financing a product under a medium-term transaction or a medium-term documentation, we do not convert that into a long-term document. All right. However, there have been circumstances in the past where a buyer has wanted its medium-term obligation to be absorbed into a long-term obligation. Can that be done? And the answer to your question is yes. The determination is made on a case-by-case basis. It is generally very specific and very rare, but we can look at it. Question: does Ex-Im Bank deal with Iraq? Yes, Ex-Im Bank is currently open in Iraq in both what we call the public sector and the private sector. We are currently open to support transactions with a total repayment term of up to 7 years. We'll be able to take a few more questions, and then unfortunately we're going to have to log off. Question: can foreign duties be included in the loan? Generally, Ex-Im Bank does not pay foreign customs duties, or not allow for foreign customs duties to be financed. However, in some circumstances, Ex-Im Bank has allowed for value-added taxes, which are the responsibility of the exporter sometimes, to be included in the overall financing. So therefore, yes, value-added taxes, which can be identified sometimes as foreign duties, may be included in the Ex-Im Bank financing. Question: can you please speak to financing renewable energy in Africa? Ex-Im Bank has recently created a renewable energy group specifically tasked with supporting environmental technology throughout the world. Obviously, with that said, we can support such transactions in Africa. We have looked at doing some renewable energy transactions such as solar and geothermal. However, to be honest, we have not done a number of transactions in this market. This is not to say we are not interested. So what I would say to this question is that if you have a particular transaction, I highly encourage you again to contact Ex-Im Bank so we can discuss this one-on-one, talk about your transaction, and determine the appropriate structure and the appropriate financing product to suit both your needs and your buyer's needs. Question, does Ex-Im Bank do business in Ghana currently? Answer, yes, Ex-Im Bank is open in Ghana, and we've done a number of transactions both in the Ghanaian public and private sector. Ghana is one of our most robust markets in sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore we do encourage you, if you have a Ghanaian transaction, to approach us. In the end, I do want to sum up one thing. As I mentioned earlier, Ex-Im Bank does have certain policies that govern our transactions, and one of them is the shipping requirement, and there have been some questions on that. The shipping requirement, which I noticed the slideshow did not cover, but the shipping requirement does state is the following, and please write this down because this is very important if you're looking to finance a long-term transaction with Ex-Im Bank. For all transactions that are that are long-term guarantees in excess of $20 million, or all direct loans, Ex-Im Bank requires that you ship on a U.S. flagged registered vessel. If you do not ship on a U.S. flagged registered vessel, and even though you may have received support from Ex-Im Bank's financing would be voided. Therefore, it is very important that when you are making logistical arrangements that you secure shipping on a U.S. flagged vessel. If a U.S. flagged vessel is not available, for whatever reason, you will need to seek a waiver. Waivers are provided by the Maritime Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation. Ex-Im Bank has nothing to do with actually receiving the waiver, but the waiver is important and is critical for you to be able to benefit from Ex-Im Bank financing. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time and participating with Ex-Im Bank's webinar. Should you have any questions, I do encourage you to call the 1-800 number and or get on our website. Please remember that Ex-Im Bank has regional offices located throughout the United States. Should you have any questions that were not sufficiently addressed in this presentation, and or should you have transactions that you'd like to discuss with Ex-Im Bank in greater detail, I do encourage you to contact our regional office. Thank you.
I want to add my thanks to both you, Kyle, and to those of you that have participated in today's webinar. This webinar will be placed on our website, www.exim.gov. Just give us a few days to transcribe it and get it posted. You will receive from us a little thank you note and a short questionnaire. We would appreciate it if you could quickly respond to the 7 questions that we have included there. Also, we are conducting global access events throughout the United States to introduce Ex-Im Bank to small business. Our next global access event will be in Lafayette, Louisiana on the 28th of February. We also will be having our annual conference on March 31st and April 1st. Again, thank you for your participation and including us in your activities today. This will conclude the webinar. Thank you.